very grateful for this opportunity to participate in this webinar and to present some ideas. Basically, the idea of a worker-peasant alliance, though it can be traced back to Engels's peasant wars in Germany, was foregrounded in Lenin's writings, particularly his two tactics of social democracy, in which he put forward the argument that in countries which come late to capitalism, the bourgeoisie is not strong enough or confident enough, is in fact afraid to carry through the anti-feudal democratic revolution. As a result, the democratic aspirations of the peasantry cannot be satisfied by the bourgeoisie, and it requires, therefore, the proletariat to carry through the democratic tasks of the revolution. Therefore, a worker-peasant alliance is possible, which can then lead on to socialism. Of course, in the process, the allies of the working class within the peasantry would keep changing. For instance, at the democratic stage, the rich peasants may be your allies, but when you are making a transition towards socialism, then they would drop out. Now, this idea, which actually informed revolutionary movements in the entire third world over the last 100 years, the names of the revolution in which the worker-peasant alliance would capture power, or the working class party would capture power with the support of the workers and peasants, kept differing. One talked of a people's democratic revolution, new democratic revolution, democratic dictatorship of workers and peasants, but all of them basically visualized a situation where the democratic revolution was carried forward by the working class, and the peasantry's interest lay in allying itself with the working class precisely because the bourgeoisie could not really do this. Only the working class could. Now, this idea of a worker-peasant alliance in the era of monopoly capitalism, however, has a further basis to it. Monopoly capitalism, emergence of monopoly, not only squeezes small capitals, it also squeezes petty producers, including peasant agriculture. As a matter of fact, it's remarkable that the emergence of monopoly was associated with a shift in the terms of trade between agriculture and industry against agriculture in the entire period from the late 19th century right until the Second World War. Now, that was really a symptom of the fact that the emergence of monopoly in the advanced capitalist countries was associated with the squeeze on peasant agriculture, pushing peasant agriculture into a crisis. And this crisis, of course, came to a head. It reached its acme, its climax in the period of the Great Depression, in which the peasantry all over the world, particularly in the third world, suffered greatly. It got into debt, it was dispossessed, it was distressed, and so on. I mean, there are lots of literary pieces which describe in this period the pain and the acute distress of the peasantry. Now, in the post-Second World War period, with decolonization, the post-decolonization states that came into being in many of these third world countries, my emphasis would really be on the third world, came into being in the third world countries, these new states actually tended to protect and defend the peasantry against the encroachment of monopoly capital. They, for instance, introduced protection so that the peasantry could be protected from fluctuations in world market prices, quantitative restrictions on trade in agricultural products. They introduced subsidies for peasant agriculture. They introduced assured procurement, assured prices at which the peasants' crops could be bought over, assured remunerative prices in which the peasants actually got a certain proportion of remuneration to their satisfaction. Then they introduced, for instance, irrigation investment, research and development under the aegis of the state, which was then disseminated as far as peasants were concerned through state-run extension services. So the state came in very many ways to defend and protect the interests of the peasantry. Obviously, not all peasants were equally benefited by it. The better ones got more benefits out of it. But on the whole, the peasant agriculture, the kind of distress it had seen in the pre-Second World War years, was no longer visible in the post-Second World War period of what I would call dirigist development. Now, with neoliberalism, however, we now have a change again. We now have a situation where the state, its role is no longer now to defend the peasantry, but to actually allow monopoly capital free play. And this it does by withdrawing subsidies. Through the WTO rules now, agriculture cannot be protected through tariffs or quantitative restrictions. Public investment in irrigation has come to a halt in most of these countries, which are subject to fiscal austerity because of the IMF conditionalities. Likewise, you have privatization of education and health services, which is again a result of the IMF's austerity imposition on these countries. And at the same time, the idea of providing assured remunerative prices is something which has receded to the background, at least as far as the cash crops are concerned. Therefore, the peasantry is once more subject to debt and distress. And here, I'm not just talking about this or that group of peasantry. This is something which affects the bulk of the peasantry, almost the entirety of the peasantry, with the exception of those who have migrated out of agriculture, whose main occupation now is really outside agriculture. I mean, running cinema halls or doing businesses and so on. But fundamentally, those who remain in the agricultural sector are really victims of neoliberalism. Now, in this situation, obviously, many of them, as I said, get into debt. I know the figures for India, where over the last 2.5 decades, 300,000 peasants have committed suicide because they cannot pay back their debt. And as a result, there's a situation of acute distress. In this situation of acute distress, many peasants then migrate to the cities. When they migrate to the cities in terms of jobs, there are no jobs in the cities. As a result, they join the reserve army of labor. But of course, the reserve army itself is now taken on a different character, where you don't have some people who are permanently employed and some people who belong to the reserve army, but rather everybody, almost everybody, is employed only for a part of the time. So it's as if everybody belongs partially to the active army of labor, partially to the reserve army of labor. That is the form that employment rationing takes in the contemporary world. Now, because of that, therefore, not only are the peasants experiencing a drop in their standard of living, and along with the peasants, of course, the agricultural laborers also are experiencing a drop in their standard of living, but the entire working population. Because when they migrate to the cities, crowd the labor market, then you find that the bargaining strength, even of organized, unionized workers, tends to go down, and everybody, therefore, experiences a weakening in their material position. Put differently, the relation between the workers and the peasants can be mediated through the product market, through labor market, through multiple markets. Now, the the mediation through the product markets have become less important now than the mediation through the labor market, because of which there is a synchronous decline in the conditions of life of the entire working population, peasants, workers, everybody. Now, this provides an excellent opportunity to fight neoliberalism on the basis of a worker-peasant alliance. One of the problems with the worker-peasant alliance, however, is that if you say that segments of the peasantry that come with the working class today, in the fight against monopoly, in the fight against neoliberalism, would later on be dumped when we move towards the socialist revolution, then they would not come in the first place. They would not come to you if you have a theory in which you actually say that they are allies, they are our allies only in the first phase of the revolution, but we are going to drop them. In fact, we're going to turn against them in the second phase of the revolution when we move towards socialism. Therefore, it is important that the entire segment of the peasantry that comes to with the working class in the first phase of the revolution, the democratic revolution, in the anti-monopoly revolution, anti-monopoly capital revolution, continues through to the end. That therefore, that we have to think in terms of a transition to socialism that actually relies upon the self-transformation of segments of the peasantry towards more collective forms of organization, rather than simply dropping large sections of the peasantry, making them into enemies, in which case they wouldn't even come with you to start with. We have to think in terms of a situation where there is a tendency towards a self-transformation of segments of the peasantry in the move towards socialism. In other words, those who come with the proletariat to start with must be the ones that stick with the proletariat and transform themselves as time goes towards collective and cooperative forms of organization. Now, in the left, there has always been historically a fear that this would give rise to capitalist restoration. In fact, the reason why a segment of the peasantry that may have been with the proletariat in the initial stage is later on turned against is because that is seen as the seedbed for the development of capitalist restoration. Now, I think that's a completely misguided idea. The idea that commodity production inevitably gives rise to capitalism through differentiation is, in my view, a wrong idea. It's an idea based on a misunderstanding of the nature of commodity production. Not all production for the market is commodity production. As a matter of fact, in countries like India, you have been having for millennia petty producers producing for the market, but there was no tendency towards a capitalist development prior to the introduction of colonialism. This whole idea that therefore petty producers would differentiate among themselves and develop capitalist production is an idea which I think is false. It's an idea that is false. Has to be properly understood. A commodity for the buyer is a use value and an exchange value. But a commodity for a seller is only an exchange value, so much money. In other words, people don't, let's say Amazon, the owner of Amazon doesn't really bother what commodities he's selling, because that commodity in the evening is not going to come to his house for him and his family to consume. So the point is that commodity production that gives rise to differentiation, commodity production that gives rise to capitalism is not any production for the market, but a very specific production for the market, where, as I said, it introduces annihilating competition. It introduces a competition in which there is a tendency towards the annihilation of some producers. Now, that differentiation and that kind of commodity production typically arises because of long-distance trade. not because of local selling. A group of people who exchange amongst themselves, even if the exchange is mediated by money, are not really producing commodities, because that gives rise to no differentiation. Personal relationships are not really obliterated by that kind of exchange. Exchange that is, let's say, are stimulated by long distance trade, where there's an impersonal market in which you're selling, is the kind of thing which is a necessary condition, not even sufficient, for the emergence of the kind of commodity production that gives rise to capitalism, for the emergence of the kind of commodity production that introduces differentiation. Now, that is not necessarily the commodity production that would come about in a society making a transition to socialism, where there's a worker-peasant alliance, and the workers do not dump segments of the peasantry for fear that this is going to be the basis for the restoration of capitalism. That's the kind of idea that, for instance, in China, during the period of the Gang of Four, there was this idea that really commodity production the basis of capitalism, and therefore ultra-left policies were suggested about to be adopted for the petty producers. Now, therefore, I believe that if we rectify our understanding and the proletariat carries through its allies from the democratic to the socialist stage, creating conditions for a self-transformation of this segment of peasantry, which is the working classes allies, towards socialism in that case, or towards collective forms of organization, then we would be in a much stronger position. I say all this because in India at this moment, there's a tremendous peasant struggle that is going on against neoliberalism, and I don't want the progressive and left forces to cut themselves off from the struggle because of the fact that they see all kinds of classes within it, whom then they are going to say, we ally with you now, but later on we are going to. Thank you very much for your patience.